This episode of New Politics was released on the 3rd of August, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the cabinet reshuffle and what this means for the next election, the problems with the lack of action from the National Anti-Corruption Commission continue, is it time for Barnaby Joyce to leave politics for good? And a real-life episode of Succession could spell the end of News Corporation as we know it. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, childless cat lady.
And just our regular message, if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through Patreon or Substack, or you can go to newpolitics.com.au and purchase one of our books. And all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Good governments aim high, they work hard and they draw on a diversity of talent. And that certainly is what drives me. And that's what drives the changes I'm announcing today after that more than 2 years. The most stable period, might I say, of government certainly in living memory, if not forever.
The federal cabinet has been reshuffled, and these types of acts are usually made by the Prime Minister to prepare the government for an election. The vacant positions have been filled by Andrew Giles in Skills and Training, and Mulundiri McCarthy has become the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And there have been some changes to some other portfolios, but the biggest change of all is Tony Burke becoming the new Minister for Home Affairs. And that's a department that has been a disaster of a portfolio ever since Malcolm Turnbull recreated the Ministry of Home Affairs in 2017 to keep Peter Dutton occupied and keep him away from challenging Turnbull for the Prime Ministership. And I think that there were just too many areas within the Department of Home Affairs, which is generally what happens when a portfolio is created purely for political reasons or to keep a political opponent at bay. Some items have been dropped off from the Office of Home Affairs. ASIO and the Australian Federal Police have become the responsibility of the Attorney General. And it's probably too difficult politically to completely dismantle the Office of Home Affairs and have separate departments for immigration and border force. So the government will just have to make it work as well as possible. And I think Tony Burke might be the right person to do this.
Certainly, Tony Burke is one of the government's better performers. He's not universally loved outside of Parliament, but there's no doubt that he's always performed well as a local member, and I can speak to that as he is my local member, quite visible. He's always seems to be looking out for the members of his electorate. It's a diverse electorate, but he's earned his safe seat, I think is fair to say. I've met Tony a couple of times. I can't claim any friendship or knowledge of him, but I think I probably should declare that. Next week, he's holding a meet and greet at one of the local cafes, so you can go and talk about your concerns to him. But not many ministers, and particularly ministers of several cabinets, do that. He's got 4 ministries now, including the huge and unwieldy Home Affairs office. So it was a good choice for him. I know there's speculation that it was a way of fending off rivals, and that's possible too. The dismantling or the restructuring of Home Affairs should have probably just gone to one person, because I think that's going to be a big job. And I wish Ministry for the Arts was its own thing in Cabinet rather than part of a super ministerial office. And it probably shows the priority of the government that art's seen as a smaller department will just get shuffled in under a couple of larger departments. I think it's right that ASIO and Federal Police go back under the Attorney Generals. I can't help but feel that was just poor tactics from Turnbull, giving the military and paramilitary guys to Dutton. One, bad idea anyway, but two, they are organisations which require a lot of oversight from the Attorney General. So to have them outside of the Attorney General didn't make a great deal of sense. I suppose there's the argument that the Attorney General could be more balanced if they were outside of their purview. But I think given the nature of both of these organisations to be operating within lawful boundaries, Attorney Generals is the better fit.
And there was that speculation that Tony Burke needed to boost his profile a little bit to maintain some sort of buffer in that seat of Watson. And that will be a seat to be targeted by the Muslim vote group at the next election. But Tony Burke is already a senior member of the government, and I don't think that would have been part of the government's thinking. It might have been, but I just don't think so. But I think that generally Tony Burke is a good performer and is skilled in warding off political problems or managing those political problems when they do arise. And I think that trimming off those parts of Home Affairs, ASIO and the Federal Police, that's probably an acknowledgement that the portfolio was just too big and it was too unmanageable and too unwieldy. And as you mentioned, I think it gets back to those decisions made in 2017 where Malcolm Turnbull set up Home Affairs in a way to keep Peter Dutton busy with all of these unmanageable programs and stop him from becoming the Prime Minister. Well, that plan didn't work out so well. It did stop Peter Dutton from becoming the Prime Minister, but it didn't stop Malcolm Turnbull from losing the Prime Ministership back in 2018. But Peter Dutton was too incompetent. He was just too ambitious to become the Prime Minister to do all of those jobs properly. And I think he's just one of those politicians who was too ambitious without skill. But the Home Affairs Department has never had great leadership anyway. Peter Dutton and Karen Andrews were quite incompetent. We had Scott Morrison as the Secret Minister for Home Affairs as well. And I don't think Claire O'Neill managed the department very well. Personally, I just don't think that was the right portfolio for her. But ultimately, you judged on the results. So she had to be moved. And Home Affairs has also got a lot of complex political issues attached to it. There's visa issues, there's immigration, there's border security, asylum seekers. And these are all political issues that can be weaponised so easily by conservative interests and by the LNP. And that's likely, or these are likely to be an issue in the lead up to the next election. You can just never know when any of these issues are going to be magnified. And I wish that wasn't the case, but that's what tends to happen in Australian politics. And there's already been the claims by the Liberal Party that Tony Burke got the job so that he could prioritise visas for Palestinian people. And that would actually be great if he could do that. But that's not pushed forward by the Liberal Party as a good thing. They will only weaponise these things in all sorts of ways that are primarily negative. So perhaps putting Tony Burke into the position is some kind of insurance policy. And when the problems arise, he's likely to be on top of them quite quickly.
Yeah, I think putting Peter Dutton in, given Dutton's well-recorded incompetence as a minister, into a big unwieldy department that required a deft hand, political skill and a sensitivity, shows again that Malcolm Turnbull made a fairly major lapse in judgment there. I think Turnbull at the time was under a lot of pressure to kowtow to the right, which he should never have done.
Well, he kowtowed to the right wing of the party, and then 12 months later he lost the Prime Ministership anyway.
Yeah, exactly. They always hated him. Instead of treating them with the contempt they deserved, he treated them as if they were serious, competent ministers who could do the job and that they needed him more than he needed them. And then when they didn't need him anymore, they dumped him, which is typical of the Liberal Party far right. So you get this unwieldy department that requires a lot of subtlety, that requires a lot of skill, that requires a lot of ability, and you give it to Peter Dutton. 6 or 8 years down the track, it's a basket case. Claire O'Neill, I think, did the best job she could. That she didn't do a better job was less because she lacks ability as a minister, but she was possibly needed another couple of years in another ministry. She should perform better where she is now. I also think that having this border force toxic male nonsense, it should just be customs. Not everyone who crosses the border should be made to feel like a minority with the black uniforms and the intimidating, fill this form out, what do you have in your bag? Immigration is a mess because of our media, really because of our media stirring up problems. The immigration is one hampered by the fact that Australia is one of the very few natures that has an immigration law as opposed to immigration policy. In Australia, it's all in the law, which gives the minister, because the drafters of the legislation, and it was the White Australia policy, but it's now the Immigration Act. The drafters knew that the law couldn't cover every single contingency. So the minister was given discretion to override the law in certain cases. So it's not a bad system, of course. Not bad systems get ruined by bad actors. And that's just one of the challenges with immigration. And when you have immigration, customs, ASIO, federal police, departments and policies that should have been separated and not run by the same person. So we can't hold it against Claire O'Neill. And a part of me wonders if she did quietly ask if she could be moved to a quieter portfolio because she's exhausted after 2 years of trying to wield this mess.
And I think that because Home Affairs, or at least most of those areas that make up Home Affairs, are usually politicised, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he just wants to stabilise and neutralise these issues as much as possible and to make sure that they don't get out of hand in the lead up to the next election. And as we've discussed, Andrew Giles and Claire O'Neill, they were probably not the right fit for the portfolios that they had, and that was Immigration and Home Affairs. And it just seems that they weren't able to put out those fires when they arrived. And that's one thing that Prime Ministers really hate, issues that arise and they're not dealt with properly. And so the cabinet reshuffle is all done. But for me, there was one surprise, and we discussed this last week, and that was leaving Tanya Plibersek in the environment portfolio. And there was speculation that she would be moved to a different portfolio, possibly back to the education portfolio that she held in opposition. And generally, I think you do want your best performers front and centre in the lead up to an election campaign. But Anthony Albanese does see Tanya Plibersek as a leadership challenger. So you do want to put someone like that in a prominent position, but not too prominent. But I think it's always going to be about preparing the best cabinet that you've got available to you, taking into account all of those factional limitations and impediments that do exist. But there's a little while to go before the next election, 8 or 9 months possibly, so it should give them all enough time to start with their preparations for the next election.
One of the master politicians we had was, of course, Robert Menzies, who was able to hold on to the prime ministership for 16 years. And one of the things that he got the reputation of doing was promoting rivals. And when I mean promoting rivals, getting them out of government. Casey becomes Foreign Affairs Minister for a long time, which keeps him out of the country, and then Governor General. Alexander Downer's father gets promoted to High Commissioner to London. This became a bit of a stroke of genius because it meant that people who had no chance at all of becoming Prime Minister and who'd underperformed could be moved out, and they think, oh, he moved me out because I had a chance of knocking him off and becoming Prime Minister. He was scared of me. So I don't think that Anthony Albanese is at that stage of his Prime Ministership yet, and I don't think that the people who he hasn't moved are at that stage of their career. But filling a ministry is a tricky thing. I think you also got to make sure that you've put the best people into the job. Now, that's not always going to happen. So, yeah, and a cabinet reshuffle brought on really by the resignation of 2 fairly prominent ministers is a chance for us to see how well the Prime Minister deals with circumstances that perhaps he wasn't happy with, that seemed good at the time. Which ministers should have been better, which ministers surprised. This one we gave a junior ministry to, but she's ready for cabinet type thing. And, a chance to try out a couple of backbenchers who've done well. But, yeah, I think all eyes will be on Tony Burke as he tries to control an uncontrollable department.
And this cabinet reshuffle is to prepare the government for the next federal election. But as always, there's a wide range of issues that will come into play in the lead up to the next election. And one of those is the rate of inflation, and that's gone up slightly to 3.8% over the past year. Here's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, making the announcement.
Well, today we got important new data for inflation in our economy, and what that showed was that headline inflation in the June quarter was 1% and 3.8% through the year. Trim mean inflation was 0.8% and 3.9% through the year to June 2024. This means that underlying inflation in our economy continues to go down. Underlying inflation is going down in annual terms and in quarterly terms. So what this means is that we are seeing underlying inflation in our economy moderate. We would like it to moderate further and faster, but this is the 6th consecutive quarter that underlying inflation has moderated, and it is also moderating in quarterly and annual terms, and we welcome that. Inflation in our economy is more persistent than any of us would like, but it is much lower than the more than 6% inflation that we inherited when we were elected a little over 2 years ago. When we came to office, inflation had a 6 in front of it, and now it has a 3 in front of it.
And the number itself is not what causes the problem, but the effect of that number on the electorate is the big issue. You know, it could be 2% or it could be 10%. If that's manageable, well, that's all that matters to the electorate and how they feel these particular issues going on. And it doesn't really matter how these figures are worked out by economists or presented by ministers or the government with the Reserve Bank. The way that people feel about these issues out there in the electorate, well, that's all that matters. And it relates to so many different factors of consumer sentiments, electoral behaviour. Prices fluctuate all the time, and some people can adjust to changing economic circumstances quickly and some people cannot. For lower income people and families, if you're right on the poverty line or hovering just above, it's always very difficult to make any adjustments at all. And I think it's also a question of who they will blame for these sort of issues politically and whether they want to inflict enough punishment on the government. Now, the Labor government is a first-term government, and the first-term government has not been thrown out of office since 1931, so that's 93 years ago. And if the electorate blames the government or considers them to be incompetent, well, that's a different issue. But the key issue is whether the electorate can see that this government is creating a better pathway for the future, despite all the economic issues that are present at the moment. But even still, it's hard to see the electorate going back to the Liberal National Coalition at this stage of the electoral cycle. And of course, it's always possible, but I just think that it's quite unlikely at this stage.
Yeah, you can never say never. I think that inflation going up should be tempered by that it didn't go up as much as we were expecting. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And we're now far enough away from the old government that the current government can start to take credit for economic success. They've had a pretty good treasurer and a pretty good finance minister, and the fruits of their labour are starting to pay off.
But I think a lot of this also gets down to controlling the narrative. And by that, I don't mean seizing the media and setting up all the channels of propaganda, but having a good narrative to put forward to the electorate. You know, outlining the sort of economic direction the country is going in and putting out that message that this is the right type of government to do this. And it can't just be empty rhetoric or saying that everything's absolutely fantastic. It's got to be the rhetoric or a story or narrative or whatever you want to call it. It just has to match up with people's lived experience. There's no point in telling people that everything is fantastic if that's not what they're experiencing. So I think it is a little bit of a balance. And if the government can't do this, I think that they will have problems. But even still, if they do have problems getting that effective message across, people might end up being unhappy with the government, but then they'll look across at Peter Dutton and the motley crew at the Liberal and National parties and think, no, I don't think so. I don't think you'll be able to do any better, and they'll stick with the government. And generally, first-term governments do not get punished unless they're completely useless, like the Campbell-Newman government in Queensland or the Marshall government in South Australia or the government of Ted Baillieu in Victoria and Dennis Napthine. And they were all basket case governments that were either too ideological or too incompetent, and they were thrown out after just one term. And my feeling is that the Albanese government isn't like that. Now, sure, there's issues and there's problems that are there, and that's what always happens with the first-term government. But overall, it just doesn't seem like there's the right political conditions for the Liberal and the National parties to pick up the 21 seats that they would need to form government. And despite all the excitement that a lot of right-wing commentators have about the polls, which are fluctuating between 51% and 49% in the two-party preferred vote for the government, when compared with quite a few previous governments who 8 months out from an election were way behind in the polls and then went on to win the next election. And that's what happened in 1998, 2001, 2004, 2016 and 2019. So I think they're doing quite favourably at the moment. So all of this doesn't actually predict anything, but I think you do have to look at political history. I just don't think the anti-government sentiment is strong enough, and politics is certainly a lot more volatile than it might have been 10, 15 or 20 years ago, but I just think that the anti-government sentiment isn't there at the moment.
To go back to 1931 with the Scullin government, Scullin was hit by three major forces that he had no control over. A couple of years later, he would have gone down as one of, maybe not a top 10 government, but certainly in the top half. But he had three things that Anthony Albanese hasn't had yet. Most obviously, the Great Depression hits just after he takes over, the Wall Street crash, the tightening of credit, and an economic crisis that was not of his or the Labor Party's doing, but it was certainly what they had to deal with. They couldn't deal with it because the Labor Party then splits over how you deal with this. The third factor is that the remnants of the Nationalist Party are still competent and still relatively honest and still able to convince the electorate that they can govern. I can't see any of that happening to Peter Dutton, Suzanne Ley, Angus Taylor, etc. So that's why I think the government will retain government, maybe in minority. The minority won't be forced from the Liberal Party. It'll be forced from more teal or otherwise independents. Scullin, so that's at a federal level. The states are all different, but were mostly to do with incompetence and corruption. And there were probably a few other state governments that deserved to be one term as well, but weren't.
Well, it's also a case where the electorate might not like a particular government or not be favourable to the decisions that they're making, but they can still regard them as competent.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a totally different issue, I think.
Yeah. Basically, if you're not competent, you won't get government back.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
Corruption issues are in the spotlight again, and there's new information coming out about the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Not so much about what they are doing, but what they are not doing. And it seems that they are not investigating corruption, which is the whole purpose of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So last month they decided that they wouldn't be making any further investigations into the failed and disastrous robo-debt scheme implemented by the former Liberal National Government. And in a related matter, the Australian Federal Police has decided that it will not pursue the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison for perjury and giving false information at the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. And generally, David, we do not want to see witch hunts and investigations just for the sake of it, but most of the work for the National Anti-Corruption Commission seems to be deciding what not to investigate. And after its first full year of operations, it just doesn't seem to have found very much corruption at all.
My understanding is it's been one dodgy baggage handler at Mascot Airport. Must do better if it was a school report. Putting another ex-military person into a position which is not suited to their skills has been a problem. And if you were to point to one event that suggested the need of the knack, it was the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. And the anguish of people who finally felt that justice might be done. To have Brereton say, well, we're not going to, it's already being investigated, and we'd just be, one, totally misread the room and was a betrayal of trust for those people. Brereton should be sacked and the commission restructured into an independent judge or an independent senior barrister who is relentless and who wants to find, or at least root out the corruption that there is. Again, not for witch hunt purposes. The public thinks that Scott Morrison has a lot to answer for. Now, he might get fully investigated properly and found, well, actually, he did nothing wrong. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but we live in an infinite universe with infinite possibilities. Till he gets a proper court trial, he'll always have that shadow of guilt hanging over him. And if he has the trial and it turns out he's guilty, then appropriate consequences can be meted out. And I think that's what the vast majority of people want. Yes, they don't like Morrison, as they don't like many others. Yes, they don't like Angus Taylor, etc., etc. But nobody wants to see the government arrest its political enemies or political opponents for the sake of them being political opponents. They do, however, want to see justice done and seen to be done. And NAC should have been the perfect vehicle for that, and it's failed.
I think this has been an underlying theme for the past few months, but with each announcement that the NAC makes, well, people are asking, well, what's the point of this National Anti-Corruption Commission? And at this stage, it just seems like a bureaucratic black hole where referrals are made and they come out the other side marked up with, stamp, here's nothing to see here. Or maybe it just goes into a shredder. Who knows what goes on there? And the Australian Greens have put in a referral about an $11 billion deal to the Australian subsidiary of a British weapons manufacturer, and that's ASC Shipbuilding. And the contract was initially for $2.25 billion, and now it's gone up to $15 billion. And a lot of defence contracts are inherently corrupt, in my opinion, because of the commercial in-confidence arrangements and because defence is just a hungry beast that gets whatever it wants, and also because of the large sums of money that are involved. So there might be something to see here, and it might also be a case where the Australian Greens are trying to make political mileage or just set this up as a test to see what the national anti-corruption is really like. But these are outrageous sums of money. But that's new corruption. It doesn't have to be new corruption. There's also old corruption under the Liberal National Party when they were in government, and the National Anti-Corruption Commission does have retrospective powers, but it could look at that $30 million sale of land worth $3 million at the Western Sydney Airport. There's all of those corrupt water deals and licences. There's the connections with the Cayman Islands, sports frauds. There's a whole lot of stuff that could be investigated, and I can't imagine that these wouldn't have already been referred to the NAC. And during its first year of operations, the National Anti-Corruption Commission has received over 3,000 referrals, and just over 500 are currently under assessment. There's 26 corruption investigations. Only 5 have actually gone to court. And I've actually got good news, David. You mentioned that there was 1 conviction before. There's actually been 2 convictions, and so it's good news. All things are looking up, and you really had to look hard to find out about those convictions. And there's the baggage handler, there's the misuse of credit cards at the Federal Police, and another at the Australian Taxation Office looking at tax files without permission and accepting bribes. And it's almost like they don't want anyone to know about this, even about their successful convictions. Not 1, but 2. And I realise that legal cases do take some time, but 5 cases going to court and just 2 convictions, well, that's a very small success rate. And why have 2,500 referrals been ruled out? And we'll never know what they were or why they were ruled out, but the success of the National Anti-Corruption Commission will be viewed through a political lens rather than the actual output, but it just doesn't seem to be off to a very good start.
No, it's been a disaster. I suspect we don't hear the government talking much about it because the government knows it's disastrous. I don't know how long Brereton's contract is, but it's time to pay it out and get someone else in. Someone who is prepared to use the NAC as a tool of anti-corruption, not as a bureaucratic tool to determine who gets what. And yes, Morrison should have been again investigated, arrested, charged and tried for his alleged malfeasance. And if he was innocent, good, he's innocent. That's great. But till that happens, we'll never know.
And in a little bit of corruption closer to home, in New South Wales, the former Premier Gladys Berejiklian has failed in her appeal to overturn findings that she engaged in serious corrupt conduct. So that means that she is still regarded as a corrupt former politician and always will be. Some experts have suggested that if Gladys Berejiklian had fronted up to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the federal one, instead of the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, that she'd still be the New South Wales Premier and that we would have never found out about the corruption that she engaged in. And something like the New South Wales ICAC, I think that's what people want. That's one of the toughest anti-corruption commissions in the world. I think that's what people wanted for the Federal Anti-Corruption Commission, and that's just not what we're getting. And it seems that the institutions of Australia, they've actually got a high tolerance for corruption, and in some cases seem to invite it. Gladys Berejiklian is a senior executive for Optus. And that's not a secret. We've known about that for several years. But Optus say that they have zero tolerance for corruption in any form, and that's from the Singtel policy. And I think it would be interesting to see what Gladys Berejiklian would have done when she did those online anti-corruption modules that you got to do to get these types of jobs. You know, maybe she skipped them or didn't know how to complete them properly. But it just seems that there's a high level of tolerance of corruption for powerful people. And in those two cases that we referred to before, these are just lackeys or underlings that, you know, might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for powerful people, it's actually quite different. And it seems that the National Anti-Corruption Commission, a little bit of a toothless tiger, you know, finds a few low-end people guilty of corruption. But the politicians and the senior bureaucrats, well, they do go free. People like Gladys Berejiklian, who are found to be corrupt, and it's not any old sort of corruption. It's classified as serious corrupt conduct. And they end up with a high-end position in a multinational corporation where they can probably engage in some more seriously corrupt conduct.
These things are important for that reason. If consequences aren't seen, the law is worthless. If you've ever been to Thailand and the appalling... Thailand has some of the toughest penalties for motor infractions in the area, but they're never enforced, so nobody bothers following them. And it's the same. If the big threat is, oh, your case will be referred to NAC, you could have a pretty fair assumption that nothing's going to come of it, so why would you stop doing it?
Well, you can go and book your holiday immediately if you get referred to the NAC.
I'll be put on administrative leave. Great. Thailand, here I come. Again, it's not just the actions, it's the perception of the actions. And we know that investigations should be kept secret because allegations can be damaging. So I don't mind that they investigate in secret. But the second somebody is charged or accused credibly or arrested, it then becomes public with public witnesses, unless there is a compelling reason to keep the witness anonymous. But the process should be as transparent as possible. Yeah, protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and in a perfect world, nobody would be corrupt, and we wouldn't need these types of things, but we don't live in a perfect world. So we've got to make sure that these things are effective, efficient, and work as they should.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Last week we talked about the idiot politician syndrome, which I think is an extension of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that's where people overestimate their abilities and they've got no idea what's going on. And as the writer Charles Bukowski once said, the problem with the world is that intelligent people are full of doubts, while the stupid ones are full of confidence. And we had that on display this week when the National Party MP, Barnaby Joyce, decided that now is the best time to start making references to bullets and politicians.
And your greatest weapon is to turn up in numbers in Canberra, in Macquarie Street, in George Street, in Queen Street. And the bullet you have is that little piece of paper. And it goes in that magazine called The Voting Box. And it's coming up. Get ready to load that magazine. Go, goodbye, Chris. Goodbye, Stephen. Goodbye, Albo.
He made those comments at an anti-renewable energy rally last weekend, and in the context of what's been happening in the US over the past month, or in any context to be honest about it, that was totally irresponsible. Here's what the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had to say about this.
That it's completely unacceptable, that it's a test for Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton has had 4 reshuffles, he should have a 5th, and Barnaby Joyce should go. This is the sort of language which has no place in any part of Australian society, let alone in public life. And here you have a guy going to a rally, calling for action, using analogies of guns, bullets, magazines, and goodbye to three members of the government. What does this bloke have to do to lose his job?
Barnaby Joyce is a blight on the political system. He's always tolerated and encouraged by the Australian media with his rubbish brand of retail politics, but he always just goes too far. And because he's never sanctioned, he comes back for more and continues with his outrageous behaviour and commentary. And he actually once complained, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, he complained about someone sending a bullet in the post to him at Parliament House in Canberra and how unsafe it made him feel. So he should understand the repercussions of making such outrageous statements, but he's an ambitious fool. He's probably never should have gone into politics, and it is up to the National Party to remove him. And the problem is that they've got as many fools lining up to replace him. And the Nationals leader, David Littleproud, he's almost as foolish as Barnaby Joyce, but Barnaby Joyce has never been called to account. And for all of his behaviour and for all of his corruption, he's just never been called to account. And I think it would be better if he leaves politics as soon as possible and let the public debates be run by the adults in the room.
6 years ago, I wrote an article for New Politics, called it a political obituary for Barnaby Joyce. I looked it up earlier. And I said then that his political career is dead, and nothing that has happened since has convinced me that I was terribly wrong. Yes, he's still in Parliament, and yes, he still gets airtime, but he gets junior ministries right away from where he wants to be, controlling water and gas, and in the shadow cabinet, he's Veterans Affairs, I think, which means he's got absolutely no influence whatsoever. He keeps turning up on television and in the paper speaking nonsense, but he's really just filling the seat in New England. I think he needs to step down for the good of the country, for the good of the electorate, for the good of the National Party, and for the good of himself.
And the outrage about the bullet comments, well, that overshadowed what Barnaby Joyce was actually talking about at this rally, and it was a tirade about wind farms on land killing cockatoos, wind farms in the sea killing whales and dolphins, and it was just this mad rant that went on and on and on and on and on. And Barnaby Joyce is not an environmentalist or a save the whales type of person. He's just an opportunist. You know, electric cars, solar energies, batteries. He was rambling on about that. That's what he's against. And he just sees this as an opportunity to rail against issues that Gina Rinehart rails against as well, to justify all of the political donations that she provides directly to him and to the National Party. And we talk quite often about cleaning up politics and reforming politics, and David, we actually published a book about it, and having some type of mechanism to remove someone from politics who is a serial offender on all of these issues. And Barnaby Joyce has had so many chances. You know, there were all of those issues related to sexual harassment, there's corruption issues, staffing issues within his own office, possible corruption there as well. There was that payment of $675,000 for drought envoy work over 3 weeks, even though no one has ever seen that report and it probably doesn't exist. And the ultimate test in politics is the electorate. And in the seat of New England, they just keep voting him in again and again and again, and he certainly doesn't deserve to be voted in again and again and again. And I'm not sure what the solution is, because it is ultimately up to the voters of New England, but I just generally think that it should be out of politics, not within politics.
I think a group of senior national figures should fly up to Tamworth and say to Barnaby, as Gareth Evans said to Bob Hawke, "Pull out, digger, the dogs are pissing on your swag." And apparently he's got a lot of financial pressures, probably from buying land that he then tried to increase the value of till he was caught. And 3 new babies or 2 new babies, or however many it is, and problems with his other family, a lot of which I haven't really chased up because it's none of my business. I think, too, the only sort of plan B he had was getting work with Gina Rinehart, and her family have said that there's no way he's working for them. And so he's trying to be useful for Gina, and he must be achieving something for her. I suspect that if he wasn't, she'd have dumped him a long time ago. And of course, she may well have dumped him and nobody knows about it. And he's just living off the largesse of the parliamentary salary and perks that he can get. But Yeah, it's certainly clear that he's not achieving anything, whether for good or ill, in Parliament. And he should nail the final nail into the coffin, find some other kind of work. Because, yeah, it's done.
Everything I've done in my life, I've done for my children. I know I've made mistakes, but I've always tried to do the best by them because I love them.
Have you thought about the possibility that your children are actually scared of you?
Oh, fuck off. I want a broadcast network. I want to see what other news operations we can sweep up.
Local TV?
Dad, nobody watches TV.
Why shouldn't we do all the news?
Well, Kim Jong pop, because that's not how things work in this country.
And there hasn't been too much about this issue in the news, but there is a legal battle behind the scenes by Rupert Murdoch and 3 of his children, and that relates to the control of the News Corporation empire after he dies. And Rupert Murdoch is 93 years old, so the day that he dies is going to come sooner rather than later. But essentially, it's a court case to stop 3 of his 4 children from interfering in the company after he dies. And Rupert Murdoch wants Lachlan Murdoch to remain in control of his propaganda network in television and newspapers and preserve the conservative and destructive nature of News Corporation. Now, the 3 children in question, and that's James, Elizabeth and Prudence, they are considered to be far more politically moderate than either Rupert Murdoch or Lachlan Murdoch. And for some reason, Rupert Murdoch wants the cancerous influence of News Corporation in the politics of the United States and in Britain and in Australia. He wants that to be his legacy. So it's pretty clear that Rupert Murdoch has had a devastating effect on the politics in those 3 countries, and he's had the Manchurian candidates like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. They're convenient idiots. In Australia, potential prime ministers always have to go and kiss the ring of Rupert Murdoch if they want to become the prime minister and get the seal of approval. And we don't know this yet, but the suspicions are that Lachlan Murdoch will be far worse than Rupert Murdoch with his application of this far-right and libertarian ideology. But if Rupert Murdoch does die before this court case commences and the issue is unresolved, the media landscape in 3 countries could be changing quite dramatically very soon.
We've watched the decline of News Corp. It had quality papers, always had a right-wing bias, but the Australian used to be a decent newspaper. I don't think it was a great newspaper, but it was a decent newspaper, and the vision for it to be a truly national newspaper for the whole continent of Australia was a very good idea. But over the last 10 years, it's become more and more unhinged. It's become a Liberal Party propaganda sheet. Even things like the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph used to be very good at reporting the news. You'd then turn to the opinion page and you'd have all the nutty and sometimes okay analysis, straightforward factual reporting. And then you'd turn to page 10 or 8 or whatever it is to find out why the Prime Minister, if it was a Labor Prime Minister, was a total dictatorial, incompetent lunatic, and why the Leader of the Opposition was the world's greatest thing since sliced bread, for example. But over the last 15 years or so, you could see the decline in the papers. The nutty opinions would move from page 10 up to page 1. The Australian stops being a paper of record and quality and becomes a Liberal Party propaganda sheet. The Telegraph and the Herald Sun end up being shrill panic merchants. And I think as Murdoch has got older and he has suffered the usual, and maybe slower, sure, but as you get older, your mental acuity declines. I don't think I'm being controversial in saying that. And at the age of 93, he's not going to be the person he was at the age of 50 or 30 or even 70. And his opinions seem to have hardened a great deal. One thing he has over Lachlan Murdoch is that Lachlan has pretty much failed in every business he's tried, whereas Rupert was incredibly successful. That's not to say I approve of everything he's done, but there's no point in not showing his strengths, because once we see strengths, we can then look at his weaknesses, which are basically his moral failings. Lachlan doesn't even have successful businesses under his belt. So I suspect News Corp, unless it changes to go back to trying to get as big an audience as possible by still being right-wing, sure, but it needs to get a bigger audience, and it can only do that by moderating how it presents its views. And yeah, Rupert could die at any time. just at 93, of course he could. But for a 93-year-old, he's doing pretty well. But he shouldn't be running a media company for a whole range of reasons, not his age.
But there is that belief that James, Elizabeth and Prudence Murdoch, they want a far more moderate media landscape than what is being provided by News Corporation, and end this political involvement and influence and provide for a better future vision for the media. And, you know, if I was given the keys to News Corporation, that's certainly what I would be doing. And I think that's what this battle is all about. You know, that one side of the family is sick of this corrupted business model and they want that to change. And the other side of the family, that's got Lachlan and Rupert Murdoch, well, they want that to continue because it aligns with their style of politics and they want to continue to have this style of damaging political influence. And I think it says a lot about Rupert Murdoch that he was a guest of honour at the nomination ceremony of Donald Trump a few weeks ago. And if Rupert Murdoch dies right now, before this court case commences, changes to the media landscape could happen very quickly. And that's not to say that they will, but they could. And there's speculation that if this is the case, the next US election and the next Australian election could end up being a lot cleaner. And because, as Alistair Campbell said, having News Corporation around is like having a rabid dog in the room that won't shut up and has to be fed and kept quiet all the time. And you can imagine that that would be quite draining for a lot of political leaders and for a lot of governments. But if you haven't got that rabid dog in the room anymore, well, that just ends up being quite a big difference. And that's not to say that change will happen tomorrow. There's so many things that would have to fall into place for this to happen anyway. And old habits for all of those journalists all around the world are difficult to change at News Corporation. And the other factor is that if News Corporation was to vacate the field of the far right and extreme libertarianism, I'm sure that there would be others wanting to fill in that void. So this court case commences in September, so there could be a lot of fireworks over the next few months and result in quite a few changes in the international media landscape.
Yeah, certainly we're seeing the end of this phase of News Corp. Is it the end of News Corp? Quite possibly. Well, News Corp could go either two ways. It could moderate and become more appealing to a broader range of its audience. Get rid of the more nuttier late-night shows. Get rid of the less evidence-driven commentators, say. Bring in what I call the intelligent right, which has been a very hard species to find. They do exist, but it's been a very hard species to find over the last 15 years or so, and have people discuss things intelligently. If it wasn't for Murdoch, you wouldn't have had Brexit go through, and Brexit has been a disaster for the British people. Even the Brexiteers admit that. If it wasn't for Murdoch, you wouldn't have had Trump. If it wasn't for Murdoch, you wouldn't have had Morrison. I think the public won't get fooled again, as Pete Townsend so passionately declaimed in the song of the same name. They might go even further to the right too. But I think the direction that News Corp has been traditionally going in will change, and will change significantly. Hopefully for the better, but only time will tell.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.